Hello.
Hi, Deepa.
Hi, is that Richa?
Yeah, it's Richa. Oh, hey.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you.
Do we do we need to get on the video? I wasn't sure if you're using video or not.
Yeah, we're using video. I just have mine off right now because it's only 10 minutes before, it's still 10 minutes before
Okay.
the program. But I think what I'm going to say is, here we go. Yeah, so I'll
Yeah,
turn
I
it.
just wanted to see how it looks.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, no, you look good.
My God.
You have a more neutral background than me. Unfortunately, I live in a small condo, so it's very hard for me to find like a spot where I
It's our problem is that we did just some renovations in the house. So I think I might have shared it before. So what happened is that the whole house is very empty right now, and it echoes everywhere I sit. So I have to get headphones on. I have to make sure that the internet is coming good in the spot.
Yeah. And you're fine. I can hear you perfectly clearly as well. So we're good there.
Yeah. The headphones really have started helping.
Yeah.
And do you know how many people are we expecting?
I think about 40 or so was my last count.
Okay.
So yeah, we're also, so here, it is about 3 past. I was waiting because we do have a number of people registered to attend today, but it seems like everyone's still joining. So I do want to get started. We only have an hour and a half, a lot of wonderful conversations to get through. So welcome, everyone. My name is Richa Sandill. By day, I am a staff lawyer practicing in employment and human rights law at Scarborough Community Legal Services. I am also proud to hold the hat of board of directors and member of the Women's Committee at the South Asian Bar Association of Toronto. In that capacity, I am pleased to be able to moderate today's panel. It's an important discussion on approaching gender-based violence through an intersectional lens, be it whether that violence occurs in the home or otherwise. This is, I think, a long overdue conversation for us at SABA to be having, and certainly one that we're very thrilled to be able to present. The goal, obviously, of today's conversation is to talk about this topic, but I think talk about it in a nuanced way and in a way that hopefully is educational for those of us that are attending, whether we're lawyers, whether we're community agencies or otherwise, or, and also try and provide you with some tools, some resources, and just, some methods beyond just the law that we might think is our immediate recourse when advocating for survivors of gender-based violence. We have 2 experts in this area who are working in the grassroots every single day to make a difference for survivors of gender-based violence. Deepa, Mattoo, and Shalini Konanur. We're very happy to have them today to guide us through this presentation. You'll see them on your screens alongside me. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. I did send a message in the chat about this as well. Just, please keep yourselves on mute just so we can minimize background noise. That by all means does not mean don't participate. We do want you to participate. Please use the chat feature at the bottom to send in any questions. We have about an hour and a half, so until 3:30 for the actual program, and we have set aside time towards the end to answer questions from the audience. So what I'm going to say is that you type them into the chat feature, and I will collect the questions and then pose them to Shalini and Deepa at the end, and we can have you participate that way. Finally, this program is being recorded. So, at some point in the future, we hope to make this available for future viewing, since I would imagine this is going to be a really helpful resource for those of us that are working in this area or want to make a difference in this area and want to know how to do that in a better way. So with that, I'd like to properly introduce our panelists. I've already told you their names. So on one side of the screen alongside me, you will see Deepa Mattoo. Deepa is the legal director at the Barbra Schlifer Commemorative Clinic, which all of us know does fantastic and very important work in advocating for survivors of gender-based violence and just making the world a better place for individuals that face this issue. She herself, alongside being a lawyer and holding this role, is a very well-known advocate in this area. She's provided perspective on this issue to the Supreme Court of Canada. She's litigated on this issue. She's also an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School for her role as a co-director of the feminist advocacy program that is hosted at the Schlifer Clinic. So welcome, Deepa. And next to her, we have the equally fantastic and amazing Shalini Konanur. Shalini, many of us know, is the executive director at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. She's a lawyer known for her advocacy work at all levels in terms of court, in terms of before the government, on issues relating to poverty law and advocating for marginalized, racialized communities, including advocating for reforms surrounding family violence, including forced marriage. And she has been doing a lot of fantastic work in this area for a very, very, very long time, and brings an excellent perspective, particularly from her role in her career in the clinic system that serves individuals close to or at the poverty line, and a system that I'm also very proud to be part of. And I know firsthand the amount of work that it does do that intersects with the issue of gender-based violence. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us to help our members understand a bit more about this issue and how they can perhaps better advocate in this realm. I want to start off with a simple question, but I think, it's probably more important than all of us realize. And that's a question surrounding language. So, the language that's used around gender-based violence, I want to give a bit of context to, I guess, our audience, is that originally we, who are, we're like myself and the individuals responsible for, at SABA, responsible for putting together this program, like all of us are still learning, and we had originally termed this program domestic violence in the law. And through our preparation with Shalini and Deepa, we learned that, there's a broader realm to this that comes from language, and the program title is now Gender-Based Violence and Intersectional Approach. Deepa and Shalini, what role does language like that play in how you talk about these issues? So like I said, the example, gender-based violence versus domestic violence, survivor versus victim. What role does it play? And I guess what's the best way to be talking about it?
So I guess I am supposed to start first. So first of all, I'll say thank you to you, Richa, Divya, and all the members of SABA who decided to put this panel together. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone who has joined the panel with us. Minor correction in my bio, I'm currently executive director of the clinic, and I used to be the legal director for past 1 year and some months now. I am the executive director, and Tamar Wittelson is the legal director of the clinic. Everything else was correct. Saying that, the language plays a huge role, and while I do agree that we shouldn't necessarily get bogged down in the language and not necessarily look at the issues broadly, but it's important to think about language because it does change the perspective of the people we work with as our clients or constituents, but also people we work with as our colleagues. So while domestic violence has this old a way of explaining violence against women and violence against people, which kind of just gives this qualifier of something domestic, something about taking the violence between two people into a private sphere and making it something, a point of conversation in legal context and beyond as something to do, something that happens in a private space. While gender-based violence, which is a journal term, captures that any type of violence that is rooted in exploiting unequal power relations between genders. So that's broadly speaking how I differentiate, and I actually teach a class every year with Professor Janet Mosher where we start with this conversation. So what's the difference between saying a situation of violence is gender violence instead of saying domestic violence, and instead of then saying other labels that are utilized as well, and which could be said that we could say that gender-based violence actually impacts everyone. Now, this could include an intimate partner violence, a family violence, and elder abuse, sexual violence, stalking, and in some cases, violence against sex workers, immigrant women. So all of those various different forms of violence, abuse, and discrimination that actually transcends race, class, national identity, it can be captured in a broader term of gender-based violence. Something I think which we all know in this group, and I have quickly browsed through the list of the people who are attending, and I can recognize some of the names. You are probably know this better than I do, that it can be of many forms as well. It could be physical, sexual, psychological, economic, but all are usually interrelated, and they actually all trigger a complex system. The difference between the survivor and the victim language is really relevant and important, especially from my perspective, where I'm located at the Schlifer Clinic, because we believe in our mission that our work is creating an agency and empowering women. So we say, even if we can't get them the best decision, what they believe that they need to get, we can make sure that they are empowered and they are taking the agency in their hand and making decisions for themselves. So that whole notion of victimhood doesn't really gel very well with our own mission statement and our focus in the work. So survivorship is a lot more empowering in its connotation, but survivorship also means that it is a journey. It is something that is embarked upon with the incident that whatever that incident could be. As I said, it could be from the realm of intimate partner relationship to family violence to elder abuse to sexual violence, and the person is in surviving mode, and that can be much longer than their legal situation in life. So survivorship is a much broader terminology and sits much better from perspective of the work that we do.
Yeah. Shalini, would you like to add to that conversation about language? Oh, Shalini, I think you're muted. Wait, hold on. Let me make sure you're... Try now? No. Okay. Sorry, everyone. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without some kind of technical issue, right? So I guess while we're waiting for Shalini to join back on that, I mean, like you mentioned, Deepa, that you do have these conversations with, yeah, now we can hear you, Shalini. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
After you left, that it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without some kind of technical complications, right?
I have no idea what that was. All right. So sorry about that, everyone.
Okay.
And thank you so much to SABA for organizing this conversation. I think these are really important conversations for SABA members and the South Asian Bar in general to have. And just, I don't want to repeat a whole lot of the gender piece, because I agree with everything that Deepa said. And we do in our work try as much as we can to use only the term survivor. But that being said, I do want to acknowledge for everyone on the call that we still live in the justice system world, which I think is quite behind in terms of the language it uses. And so the only point I want to reiterate, and we use gender-based violence, but the point I want to kind of expand upon is sometimes the limitations of language in the law work that we're doing, because we know that depending on where you are, courts, decision makers, the stakeholders you interact with still don't have the lens. So there are two things to do there, right? You should think about advancing your own language to support those framework pieces, using the terms gender-based violence, using the term survivor, but as a way to educate those decision makers and tribunal makers as well. But sometimes I will also admit that I am opportunistic. So when the province refers to something as fundings for victims of domestic violence, you know, you may see in our documentation a reflection back of that language, because we are looking at how to get into the system using the language that the system uses. So we're in a bit of a catch-22, because I don't like that language. I agree with Deepa. The idea of domestic violence, to be frank, I think it really connotes to that old school idea of women who are married in spousal relationships, right? And I think when I meet with lots of politicians and other decision makers, they still have that view in their head. We've gone way, way, way beyond that idea. And gender-based violence is a much more expansive and inclusive term. And it's a term that also sort of includes both biological sex and gender identity, which are both pieces of the critical conversation around violence. But I think for a lot of the work that we do, we get stuck using terms that are the old school terms that are used in those systems, in those justice systems. And sometimes we do that because we know that in an immigration case, for example, I know maybe that the decision maker is going to understand it if I say it this way versus not understand it if I say it in another way. So I think we have to move ourselves in terms of our advocacy work on the types of language, on the language that we use. And as lawyers, language matters, right, for all the work that we do. But I want to also acknowledge that we're stuck in a system, I think, that still is very old school in the way it talks about violence in these types of cases.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm sure that using the word victim as opposed to survivor, that also has an impact on the way clients might see themselves when coming forward, right? And how they're treated by the system, which is a problem and something that all of us need to be mindful of as at least a starting point when we're advocating for them. I know both of you talked about making sure that gender-based violence and addressing gender-based violence is done with an inclusive approach. I think Deepa, in our conversations leading up to the panel, you described it as a you know, it operates within a culture of violence. But with that said, you know, we are having a conversation here at the South Asian Bar Association about this, and I think you know, I do want to ask, do you think gender-based violence manifests itself in specific ways in South Asian communities? And if you do, why? What can we do about it?
I think maybe that's me to start. Yeah. So this is such a tricky question, right? Because Deepa and I have worked for a long time on balancing those ideas around not painting. First of all, South Asian is a fake term, right? Like the reality is that the South Asian communities are so varied, right? And they're not necessarily that homogenous. There are some similarities, but not, oftentimes there are many, many differences, right? So, you know, we've worked a long time, and Deepa will expand on her own thoughts around not painting violence in the community as looking different than how violence and gender-based violence plays out for anybody, right? Violence is violence, right? And we did that a lot in our forced marriage campaign around trying to push back against particularly governments and media that painted forced marriage as a South Asian issue or a South Asian problem, right? Because there are real underlying currents of racism, right, within that kind of framing. So that's one piece of it, right? But there are some commonalities, right? So when I speak now about some of the things I see in the casework, I want to do it by also saying that I'm not generalizing, because this is not going to be the same experience of every South Asian client. There are so many intersections in identity for South Asian people that their experiences simply can't be the same, right? I come from a very privileged background. I don't face socioeconomic issues that my clients do. So my experience is not going to look the same as theirs. members, right? But in the work that we do at SALCO with low income clients, there are some things that we see in so many of the cases, right? One of the things that I think is a huge concern is the way in which immigration law makes many people in our community precarious and more vulnerable to certain types of gender-based violence. And because immigration law doesn't necessarily give, particularly those clients with precarious immigration status, safety and security in that status necessarily, the way in which violence gets perpetrated and the scope in which it gets perpetrated is sometimes different and sometimes more extreme. So I think that's one piece that's come to the clients we work with and likely common to a lot of communities that have that immigration piece around the precarity of the status itself. And we haven't done a great job in immigration to have permanent solutions to give people that safety. There was a time, I think, when we were working on just application after application for women who had left violence and were conditional permanent residents. And, you know, what that was doing to our communities was horrific. I think another piece that we see a lot with our clients, and this is probably the case in other communities too, is that their financial agency or their lack of knowledge or lack of understanding of the financial situation in Canada really limits their ability to make decisions for themselves in ways that are really hard to get around. Simply put, you know, if you don't have access to any kind of sort of stable financial resources, it makes your decisions around what you want to do in a situation of violence hard, right? And that's true of all people with socioeconomic issues coming up in play, right? And really the truth is for some clients, they do talk about what are the cultural implications for me of leaving situations of violence. And this comes up in many conversations we have with clients. There are still those concerns around how people view being seen as a divorcee, or there are still those concerns around being isolated then from your own family who are not pleased with the choices you're making. Sometimes clients report ideas around what their own personal religious beliefs are. I would never say that's a sweeping generalization of what any religion says on this, but it's their own interpretation. So sometimes we do see clients talking about the difficulty of what their view of their own cultural implications will be around dealing with those situations of violence. So I think I will say that those things do come up in our casework, and they are things that you know, we address with clients, but I would definitely end it just by saying that while we do see some of those things coming up, I don't think that from an outward-facing view that we'd ever take the position that violence somehow manifests itself differently, right, within South Asian communities.
Yeah, because it's a bit more of an othering approach to it than it needs to be. Deepa, do you have anything to add before we move on to the next discussion on this?
I just wanted to add something. So as Shalini said, me and Shalini worked together, you know, for many years together on this issue. And I remember those intense conversations that we would have around that talking about violence within our communities is important, but that talking needs to happen from us, right? We need to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, what happens is that discourse gets co-opted, utilized, and becomes a structural vehicle of violence against our own communities. So I absolutely 110% agree with Shalini that it's really important to talk about the structures of violence which impact our communities, because those structures of violence are not necessarily completely happening in isolation. They're not siloed impact on our community. But what happens for all of us, and I'm including myself in this, although my organization doesn't only work with South Asian, we have over 200 languages of service delivery, because that's the pool that we serve. But I can tell you, being a South Asian, I still till today understand violence within South Asian community the best, because that's the personalized, experience, the lived experience, that I bring it to the table. That lived experience could be mine, it could be my mother's, it could be my sister's, it could be my grandmother's, my aunt, my sister, my friend, but that's my lived experience. So all of us in this room right now, in this virtual room, we have touched on, we have personally touched people in our lives, or have lived experience of violence within South Asian community. So we understand it the best. So who should be then talking about it? I think we should be talking about it rather than leaving it for other people, then who then try to box us, other us, try to make a sense of it. And all of that is wrong, because the culture of violence is violence. Violence happens because of inherent power imbalance in the relationships. It happens in cases of immigrant communities a lot more, and plays out in immigrant communities in a unique way, as Shalini just said. But even in non-immigrant communities, affluent families, when it happens because there is an emotional, psychological power and control that's playing out. So I absolutely 110% agree with Shalini, and we have struggled on this many times and butted heads with politicians many, many times, that when we say that services should be culturally sensitive and culturally relevant, we are talking about service delivery. We are not talking about violence. Those are two completely different things and shouldn't be mixed.
Yeah, no, agree. And that's a very important point. I mean, in my own practice, like I've seen situations of gender-based violence where, you know, perhaps like police or agencies were called, and then you see the reports afterwards. And this was for South Asian communities. You see the reports of like the police, for example, and it's listing something like, oh yeah, we didn't really make any charges or anything like that because what they were doing was a religious practice and we don't want to touch that. And I just read it and I'm thinking, seriously, yeah. So talking about it is important, especially because, you know, that is our first experience of this and of the culture that a lot of us as from the South Asian communities are brought up in. So Shalini, moving a little bit more, you know, broadly, I guess, to the discussion surrounding resources. You talked a little bit about in gaps in terms of things like immigration and how the state ends up doubling down, I guess, at least for South Asian communities, but, you know, through things like immigration. But what are, you know, the gaps in resources for survivors of gender-based violence generally, and I guess more specifically that you've seen for Black, Indigenous people of color in your work? Where do we need to do better for resources, and what might already be available that people might not know about?
So I'm going to actually just focus my comments on people of color and say that we are always standing in solidarity with Black people and Indigenous communities, but I don't think that I can speak about what the gaps are for the Black and Indigenous community. I think that's something better left to those communities to tell you. But I can tell you, you know, there are just so many gaps. So there are gaps in the law, right? And I'm sure most of the participants on these calls butt up against those gaps frequently, right? There are gaps in the way that the law treats survivors of gender-based violence and the supports that the law provides. And actually, sometimes the state-sanctioned violence that the law creates, which actually makes people in these situations feel more vulnerable. So there are gaps there. But in terms of resources, there are huge gaps for people of color. So there's a growing, particularly in Ontario, where we know that the data shows that the South Asian communities are the largest racialized group in the province and falling into rates of poverty at significantly disproportionate rates, hovering now at around 20% versus white communities in Ontario, which are somewhere around, I think, between 10 and 11%. So systemically, we are the largest group and significantly more low income. Lots of conversation happening in Ontario around the lack of shelters that meet the needs of South Asian clients. And we see this in our daily work, right? Around trying to place people in shelter and them either not wanting to go because of the lack of sort of specific needs that they have, or actually going in. I have recently, this past week, I had a client who went into shelter and wanted to leave almost immediately because she didn't feel comfortable there. And so a lot of conversation going on around whether we need to start looking at in terms of transitional housing, in terms of shelter services, what specific services, like Deepa mentioned, are needed to support these communities, like the South Asian community. We still have a massive gap in availability of legal education in languages other than English and French. And we have really good data that certain South Asian languages are some of the top non-English French languages in Ontario. So there's constantly the push to have more things available. And, you know, places like the Schlifer Clinic do a pretty amazing job, and SALCO tries to about plugging that gap with providing those things, but it's not on us, right? It's on us to start demanding that we have the resources that we're entitled to in those languages for those communities. And I think the final thing is, you know, and Deepa will talk more about gaps, but I think the loss of the criminal injuries compensation scheme in Ontario is devastating. I think I have now tried several times to access the victim quick response program for clients, and it is just a ridiculous and poorly run program that is very difficult for clients to access. And I'm not sure if others have had different experiences, but I just find that it's inconsistently applied across regions. It's confusing, and it's just a travesty that we don't have a type of compensation scheme for people dealing with gender-based violence that actually gives them timely compensation, recognizing what they've been going through, and not putting them on a system where they have to actually make the report within a certain period of time. Because it's well known to all of us that, you know, when people choose to report violence is based on their own ability to come forward and talk, and they shouldn't be limited in what they can get and what they can do.
Yeah, by a limitation period, or, you know, an otherwise really long tribunal process. I mean, I hope everyone on this call was listening to what Shalini just said, particularly about the languages piece. There are probably a number of different South Asian languages that are on this call that people may or may not be able to speak. And I think that's, you know, what you said, Shalini, is really important, that it's not just as much as SALCO and the Schlifer Clinic and other agencies can do. There's a lot more power in what we as the South Asian bar might be able to do to assist with this issue, with things like something as easy to try and put together and put our heads together on as public legal education. Deepa, I want to ask you this, and I want to particularly ask you this about, you know, gaps in resources. Can you speak to that also, and particularly about the gaps in resources for the transgender community based on your work?
Sure. So in terms of you know, I think Shalini has kind of pointed out to a lot of, you know, relevant gaps, which are a lot of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, can, like, you know, a lot of communities relate to it. It resonates with the experience of a lot of racialized women that we work at the clinic as well. But one of the things that I want to kind of point out is that communities which have an onslaught of violence coming to their experiences on a daily basis, the gap is not only what is gap in the system, but gap is also what they experience as a gap, right? So there is obviously heightened vigilance of certain communities. There is onslaught of violence, brutality, which means that their trust in the system also has eroded to a point that even if the broken systems exist, I don't know how much they're really accessible for survivors within those communities. So that's something that comes to my mind, but I do agree with Shalini that, you know, what is peculiar experiences and unique and distinct to those particular communities, they can probably speak to it much better. But we know that, broadly speaking, from the experience of the Schlifer Clinic, for example, I can tell you that we run a criminalization of women project. We have been running this project now close to we are in 5th year, where women who are survivors of violence are criminalized in the system. And I can tell you that that project has the highest overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous women in the clinic as compared to any other program. In the rest of the programs, we actually don't have as much visibility. But in that particular program, we see that survivors we are working with again and again are either from Black community or from Indigenous community, which speaks to the huge gap which is created by the system, that women get criminalized while they are themselves survivors of one or the other kind of gender-based violence, and the system is continuously putting charges on them, or they're getting incarcerated and stuff like that. Coming to the transgender individuals and communities, again, something which is important to know for all of us is that the transgender individuals and communities experience shocking amount of violence and discrimination. Like, the numbers are really, really shocking when you look at them. Now, violence against women has been slowly recognized, and while you'll see the data, which will be like on average a woman is killed every day, or during COVID-19, there is another stats that's going around that 1 in every 10 women in Canada thinks that she can or they can experience violence. All too often in these stats or in these numbers, we ignore the experience of trans and non-binary people. That completely gets eroded or completely gets ignored. So, what are the facts that we know from the communities? We know that they live in a heightened risk of violence. Trans women, specifically those of color, can be attacked because of misogyny, sexism, transphobia, and racism. The transphobia within the racialized communities internally, as well as with the trans people from other communities, is through the roof. It's really highly problematic. There are some data which actually was done by Transfers Project a few years back, which said that as many as 98% of trans people living in Ontario experience transphobia. So clearly that the problem is really high. In terms of services, again, because this issue is so ignored, we don't have a lot of services out there. I actually looked them up this morning to see, okay, are there any services which focus just on the issue of the violence within trans communities? And other than 519 or EGAL, those usual spaces which have been on this, working really hard to bring awareness to the issue, I don't see a lot of spaces having specialized services. Even Schlifer Clinic, full disclosure, doesn't have a specialized service for trans population. Do we include non-binary population in our service provision? Yes, we do. Do we want to do better, and are we learning more and trying to be more accessible and trying to be more available? Yes, of course. But at this point, I can tell you that there is a huge gap in gender-based violence, in our shelter system, and service delivery organization like my own clinic. There is a lot more work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And I guess, Shalini, turning back to you, I mean, we've talked about resources. I want to know about the law, I guess, in all the things that we do need and in all the things that may or may not be available for survivors of gender-based violence. Do you think that the law is or can be an effective tool for preventing and addressing gender-based violence, and why or why not?
I mean, I think my answer. Do I think the law is an effective tool for preventing and addressing gender-based violence? Absolutely not, right? And the law is a huge term because, of course, there's so many areas of law. But, Deepa talked already about the criminal law, and actually I think it serves as a tool to be punitive to people facing gender-based violence. You see that frequently, right? Applying the criminal law, if you look at the situation of forced marriage, the criminalization of forced marriage didn't do anything for survivors of forced marriage, except for forcing them potentially to go even more underground for fear that families might be charged, right? And up to now, I haven't actually found a case where that section has been used. But what a great thing for the government to rest on, that they changed the criminal code and provided no supports, right? And I think that just perpetuates and is frequently in a lot of the ways in which the law manifests in supposedly being tough on gender-based violence, which it isn't, right? And we could spend hours talking about the statistics on how that all plays out. I think in immigration, there is no protection, no safety for people in these situations, nothing in the law that is concrete, just pilot projects and a lot of lip service. And so we're not there yet. In employment, we're all over the place in Canada on dealing with gender-based violence in the workplace. And, you know, we took huge steps backwards in Ontario in terms of that. And so, you know, you have to think about what's going on. I remember reading about a month ago a decision from the Immigration Refugee Board, and a board member telling a refugee claimant who was a victim of violence that, and this is paraphrasing, but this is generally which the board member said, that, you know, you kept your child, so you couldn't be a victim of rape if you kept your child, right? So that's where we're at in the law. And, you know, judges are getting more training, decision makers are getting more training, tribunal decision makers, there's been no conversation around training in gender-based violence for tribunal decision makers, where in truth, most of the lives of our clients are most deeply impacted. So has it been an effective tool? No. And I don't know that law is ever going to be an effective tool in preventing, right? Because the law is an after the fact situation. The law is very punitive and it comes into play sort of after the fact. It's not structured in a way to be preventative. So the measures around prevention fall to me outside of the law. They fall to me around what we do, what organizations do, what private stakeholders do, what other government stakeholders do, what policymakers do in really being serious. And some of the ways that we can be preventative at the core are addressing income inequality, addressing housing, addressing inadequacies in healthcare, addressing education, getting things into the curriculum. And we are not having those conversations in any meaningful way. We are, in my opinion, so far behind in all of those things that in some ways it feels that we're going backwards.
Yeah, and that's an important point, right? How can we expect the law to fix the life of someone who's already in such a broken, gap-filled system in so many ways in terms of housing or social assistance or otherwise? So that's, that is important. Sort of sticking with this topic, Deepa, how does the law impact Black, Indigenous people of color differently, sort of building on what Shalini said, than non-Black, Indigenous people of color for issues relating to gender-based violence?
Sure. So I'll tell you that there is a lot of work that has been kind of going on in this particular area. So Barbra Schlifer Clinic has been doing some work, but Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, Native Women's Association of Canada. So what I'm going to speak kind of refers to all the collective knowledge of these spaces and the work that has been happening. So I'll share some data with you and also share what the systemic discrimination actually does for specifically racialized bodies, and they are trying to access the Canadian legal system. So racialized, especially racialized folks with disability, having mental illness, or who are lower income, and or are part of sexual minority, we see there is a lot of discrimination that exists against all of them in the system. We find that they don't fit the mainstream stereotype of respectable survivor and are deemed as deviant and violent. So have we seen examples of that play out in media recently with some of the stories? Of course, we all have seen that. But remember that the stories that hit the media and things that we actually get to read is just tip of an iceberg on day-to-day experience of survivors we work with. So if they are working with a survivor who's resisting interpersonal or state violence, they are seen as not credible witnesses in their interaction with law. Sometimes we also have seen in our work that women are increasingly seen as dangerous offenders because they are not necessarily going to cooperate while experiencing interpersonal violence. We also see that Indigenous and Black women who we work with are over-policed and under-supported by the justice system, broadly speaking. in fact, Indigenous women make up less than 4% of the population and yet make 39% of the female prison population. And there is another related stats that I don't have in front of me, which also says that around 90% of them also are survivors of sexual violence of some kind. So obviously, all of this data and all of these facts tell us that that people of color definitely face a lot of systemic racism, which exists within our legal systems and justice systems. But at the same time, we also see, this is our experience on the ground, that when we are advocating for a racialized woman as compared to a non-racialized woman, we are, even the treatment of the practitioners by the stakeholders in the legal system is very different. I haven't really touched on the issue of poverty crimes. I haven't really talked about some of the layers of racialization and xenophobia that exist against Black, cis, and transgender women by the state. But those are some of the other factors that we see play out every day in our work. Overall, I think it's important to remember that while all racialized bodies get impacted by these discriminatory practices in our legal system, the most common one is questioning their credibility, questioning their survivorship is the most common experience among all of these intersectional experiences. And Black women, in our experience, are being charged with crimes 3 times higher than any other general population. So that's what I see broadly speaking, and those are the barriers and challenges that we experience.
Thank you, Deepa, for that really thorough overview of these barriers. So we'll move on now to talking a bit more about how gender-based violence might have manifested itself in COVID. Before we get there, I just want to remind everyone, we will have some time for questions at the end. I've seen a couple of questions come in, but by all means, please don't be shy. We do have, as you can see, 2 fantastic experts on this issue. So, ask away, and I'll be more than happy to moderate the questions and put them to Deepa and Shalini at the end. So moving back to our discussion. So, I mean, COVID-19 has obviously been a very difficult time for a lot of people, but I can imagine with the additional requirement to stay at home like never before, it has probably had a disproportionate impact on survivors of gender-based violence, and that's something that even the Human Rights Commission in its policy statements has outlined that individuals facing gender-based violence are at heightened risk for during this particular period in time during the pandemic. Can each of you walk us through, and we'll start with you, Deepa, how some of COVID-related issues have manifested, or how some of the issues that we've been talking about have manifested during COVID-19, and what your workplaces are seeing. So, Deepa, maybe you can start by talking about areas of criminal and family law issues that we've seen in terms of gender-based violence and how they've played out during the pandemic.
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of a reference to what my workplace actually looks like, and then I'll go into what we have seen in those particular 2 areas of law. So the Barbra Schlifer Clinic is not only a legal clinic. So we have 3 different arms or 3 different pillars of the service delivery. So one being the legal, which is, we primarily work in a few areas of law. Immigration and family are the 2 primary areas, but we also do a lot of sexual independent legal advice for sexual assault work. We have 2 specialized projects. One is the Criminalization of Women project that I just mentioned, and we also have a sexual abuse in workplace project. So those are the legal arena work. We have family court support workers who provide support in the family court as not necessarily as representing the women, but rather supporting them and in a lot of supportive advisory role. We also have counseling services and a housing program built within the counseling services, and we have interpretation services. We have a couple of other specialized projects around risk assessment, as well as looking at family courts and the risks that exist within the family courts and the gaps exist when women are interacting with the family courts. So what we saw as an immediate impact on COVID-19, and not necessarily the pandemic itself, but the solutions that were offered to the communities around pandemic was that lockdown and stay at home and work from home. All of those things were not necessarily going to work for us, and we were actually, for a while we kept our space open with the support of a high-risk team, because we knew that even if every day we are there to open a door of a walk-in client who doesn't have access to a phone or access to an email, who just decides to show up, we need to be there to open the door for her. So we never wanted our doors to be closed for the most marginalized and vulnerable. So we kept our doors open, and then we were counted as one of the essential services, which I don't know how many other services were counted as essential services, but and that really helped us in keeping the doors open and making sure that till today that the clinic has never completely closed down. So that's the impact we saw on the workplace side of things. It was really disappointing to see that the solutions for a pandemic, a crisis, a disaster did not think about women and did not think about the impact of what the impact of these solutions would be on gender-based violence. Till it was an afterthought. So at first couple of weeks, things were a lot in flux for everyone, but anyone who works in the sector like me or Shalini, we knew what this was going to do for people who were already isolated. We knew that this was actually not going to be a solution. So we all had a knee-jerk reaction. We were all trying to create parallel systems to make sure that we actually don't further isolate our clients into isolation. I can tell you there are numbers out there which are which are being shared, talking about globally that how gender-based violence saw a spike. Globally, that the UN Secretary General had to make an announcement and saying, please do a ceasefire on gender-based violence during pandemic lockdown. And I was like, sure, if that's going to work, then you have people living in close proximity with economic constraints, with less access to health, definitely that ceasefire announcement is going to do anything. But saying that, at least it gave us a global framework and helped in amplifying our voices here locally and to our own decision makers around that. So that's about the workplace setting and the impact. Now, within the framework of two areas of law that Richa just wanted me to focus on, the family law issues as well as the issues of criminal law matters. Within the family law framework, what we saw, again, we saw that the services suddenly were completely all gone, right? So all the ancillary services that, or the justice actors who are involved at the courthouses, we suddenly saw that there was a huge gap created, and for a while everything was in flux. Clients were frustrated; they didn't know what to do. Legal Aid Ontario made a move to making its summary legal advice program more accessible, and they created telephone and online formats that definitely helped. But I can tell you, even till today, the domestic violence certification, which is supposed to have a lot more easier access during COVID-19, and the financial eligibility is supposed to be really not being to be considered, we see a very different response on the ground. In some cases, we are seeing that working, and in some cases, we are seeing it not working. So we see a lot of survivors in all legal and financial eligibility requirements, sometimes being told that it is not waived yet. We will be waiving it. When you give us that XYZ information. So we see these kind of still some barriers still play out in the system. Although on paper and in their announcements, they have been very clear that all financial requirements have been waived till further notice. We also saw some virtual legal clinics come up. So our clinic took all our services virtually. Luke's Place actually launched a pro bono virtual clinic program that has been really helpful as well. Within the court work and during this closure and suspension of the operations, what we also saw is for a while it was not clear what is an urgent matter. So while we were being told that the teleconferences will be, it will be based on the urgent matters as well as the request for 14-week consent orders would be taken, we saw a limited case conferences were being held, generally no more than 30 minutes. And we are also seeing that judges are setting limits on which issue will be addressed so that they can focus on most urgent. While I appreciate what is being done, but I also want to tell you that the survivors we work with, for them, everything is urgent, and it becomes, for practitioners, really challenging in terms of how do you actually manage your client's expectation around why is your matter not as urgent as other people's matter. In terms of the criteria, and 3 potentially urgent family law issues that are being looked at are the safety of the child or the parent. So basically obtaining a restraining order or other restrictions on contact between the parties, or we are also seeing exclusive possession of the home, as well as the well-being of the child, including the wrongful removal or the detention. And in some cases, dire financial issues such as need for a non-depletion order. Those are the things that we are seeing are being given priority. I think there have been a couple of cases. So the one which is Thomas versus Barbra has been a really helpful case in making sure that we know what we want to bring forward and what we want to actually say that let's wait it out. Saying that, I have to tell you that I've been working with a coalition of a small group of people who are working on similar issues in other provinces, and Canada's response has nothing, is not consistent. People are having different experiences in different spaces. Within the criminal courts, in our experience, what we are seeing on the ground is that the domestic violence court programs were not necessarily treated any different than any other matter. So we found that urgency, which was kind of set up, was similar, which was a bit confusing for us, that how come we didn't have the IDVC being treated differently. So we are finding that as they're planning to open, things are shifting and things are moving. We also found that most of our cases that involved any kind of any court appearances where the accused was not in custody were all adjourned. We also saw that a lot of our clients who were, say, getting charged first time, they were getting frustrated with the putting off of the matters, and they would come to us and say, I just don't want to do anything. Can I take the plea that's being offered to me? Can I just, so we saw a lot of challenge in that area. We also saw that a lot of proceedings that were occurring, such as those where the accused is in custody, bail hearing, or where the matter is deemed urgent, they were all being continued by audio and video conferencing. So we saw an interesting response to in both areas of law. And as the planning for the opening of the courts is happening, I can also tell you we are still negotiating, still figuring out who will be responsible for keeping the spaces which are not necessarily deemed as a court space, but a space where our services are delivered from. We don't have clarity on what we need to bring into the court spaces and what we will be provided for. So we are still looking for clarity, and a lot of those operational pieces are still kind of up in the air for us. But we are all working, I think, in collaboration and trying to bring some clarity to the process. We are looking forward to opening of the court, especially for the family law matters where a lot of families have been struggling with no clear arrangements. So we are really looking forward to opening next month, but we are a bit nervous as well, especially for our workers, because we are not sure how some of the logistical pieces are going to work out.
Yeah, because everything's gonna just flood at once, probably. Shalini, can you speak to, I mean, we've given you a bit of a big task. Can you speak to how COVID-19 has seen gender-based violence manifest itself in terms of employment, immigration, social assistance, housing? So, all these aspects of poverty law that I know you work with.
Sure. And I just want to check in with you on time. Are we?
We're good. Yeah, we have till 3:30, so we have lots
Okay.
of lots
Okay,
of time.
fantastic. So I think there are a few things. So in terms of employment, I think what we have to keep in our minds is that racialized women are probably some of the most vulnerable workers and are overrepresented, right, in the caring and service economies and low wage work and low skilled work, overrepresented amongst those with temporary worker status, right? And so what we've seen in the clients coming through our doors is because they actually don't meet many of the eligibility criteria sometimes for income support, they continue, or they want to work, but they continue to be subject to really unsafe working conditions, right? And you only need to look at the reports of migrant farm workers dying to know that there are employers out there who are not really providing safe environments for their workplaces. And this is going to disproportionately affect those racialized people who are working, including women. And so when we talk about gender-based violence, there's an angle of actual gender-based violence for workers, right? And what does it do for workers, particularly racialized workers, people of color, who are in these situations of employment, who are not having those types of protections? And how is that going to play out? And we're kind of all over the place in terms of health and safety for those workers. And so COVID's a really challenging time to try to give advice to people in terms of what their health and safety employment law rights are, and balancing that with what their real life is and what they need in terms of being able to survive. And so there's a real vulnerability there around employment law, employment standards, right? And, you know, one of the things that we have to have very serious conversation around is just the complete lack of employment standards for workers, right? And the minimum floor, so I started as a student at Parkdale Community Legal Services in the Employment Law Clinic, and the minimum floor for employment rights is lower than when I started 24 or 5 years ago. And so the idea that we're having conversations around paid sick days that are still not resolved during a global pandemic is, to me, bizarro. And let's make no mistake about it, right? Racialized workers, and there's really good data on gender and soon to come data on race. You can look at places like the CCPA website, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, that's starting to give us that kind of information. But we have to make no mistake about it, right? This is gender-based violence playing out in employment law, in particular with disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, right? So I wanted to raise that because we don't always think about the intersection of gender-based violence and employment law, but there is a really big one there, right? Immigration I've kind of touched on in the past, but everything in immigration that is good about the system to protect people facing gender-based violence is a pilot project. So we have pilot projects for people to apply for temporary resident permits on very narrow situations of when they face gender-based violence. We have pilot projects for vulnerable workers who are abused by their employers. We have pilot humanitarian and compassion applications in a narrow area of what they say is domestic violence. That's the term they're using, right? And so there's nothing permanent in immigration legislation, and it becomes frustrating at a point. And Deepa has called, I have called, so many people have called for permanent structures in immigration that support people to regularize their status so that the impacts of gender-based violence are not disproportionately worse. And we're not there. And we're not talking about it in COVID, right? And how could we not be, right? They keep making those sort of generalized statements about how COVID has exposed the inequities. Okay, great, right? But those inequities were always there. And if they've been exposed, when are you going to do something about it, right? So we have to talk about how immigration just doesn't have that piece. In housing, you know, I touched around on the lack of supports, but there are so many ways in which housing law itself doesn't support the communities we're talking about. There are narrow definitions around who is eligible for subsidized housing, right? And who is eligible for subsidized housing is tied to certain levels of immigration status. We have huge populations now of racialized people in Ontario and in Canada that simply don't meet those thresholds anymore. And that's a big concern, right? In housing, we have not drilled down to making housing accessible to these populations. And how do you expect people to ameliorate and improve situations of gender-based violence if they can't meet basic needs like housing? And then that takes me to the final point, which is on income support, right? And we have barriers in the law to access to income support across the federal and provincial schemes that leave out so many of the people we're talking about. Basic example are the campaigns we're doing with Color of Poverty, with the Income Security Advisory Clinic on Canada Child Benefit. Canada Child Benefit, again, has ties to your immigration status. And if you don't meet those prerequisites, you cannot access that. We have calls weekly from clients who are in situations of gender-based violence who are actually thinking about the fact that if they leave their partners, they alone as the applicant won't be eligible for the CCB. They're only eligible because their violent partner has permanent residence or is a citizen. And so we have kids in this country, largely people of color, children of color, who are born in Canada, and even not born in Canada, but kids born in or not in Canada who don't get Canada Child Benefit. All of those things impact how situations of gender-based violence play out for those people in their lives. And so I think we have to really continue on our advocacy, and we have to support clients to challenge. So when you have direct casework, take those opportunities. And as daunting as it sounds, and we'll talk about what we can do, take all of those opportunities to push against those barriers that have very gendered and very race impacts and are discriminatory, right, against these populations.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's a perfect segue into our next piece, which is sort of like a thought about the role that the legal profession and those watching this program can play. So, what role can we, knowing what we've talked about today, about the inadequacies in the law, about the gaps and the need for resources, and just sort of the amplification of a lot of these issues during COVID. What role can we as advocates and lawyers play in trying to help both overcome this barrier and advocating for marginalized women in our community that are trapped due to this concept? And so I guess I'll start with Shalini, and then Deepa, perhaps you can pick up on that.
So I think, as people who practice law, it's hard to do this because the one thing that I want to encourage people to do is when you have people in front of you facing these situations, you've got to, as much as possible, obviously deal with their legal issue, but take the blinders off, right? And look at them and think about what are the other things they need, right? And a lot of the work that we do at our clinics is around addressing the legal issue, but also saying this person needs to see a housing support worker, or this person should be in touch with sort of community supports through a shelter, or this person might be eligible for victim quick response, right? So there's a way in which to try to elevate the way in which we are going to support those clients when they come to you in their private bar settings, or of course in clinic settings and any other settings you might be in. So it's not necessarily that you're going to become a client's social worker, but it's that you're thinking about how do you connect this client to the wealth of people you know and your connections and your privilege so that they can get some of the other things they need to make the situation better. Because I think a lot of us feel like there's the law, and then there's the reality of someone's life, right? Okay, we're going to tackle that tiny part, which is the law, but we have an obligation, in my opinion, to also tackle the life part in whatever way we can. And that just might mean linking them to other resources, taking a little more time, right? Giving them some of that space. And it's challenging. I know it's challenging because I know that people have busy practices and people have lots of stuff on their desk, but this is the way in which on a very macro level, we can inch up the work, right? On a larger level though, there has to be, and when I started, I struggled with this, right? You see someone come through your door, what you do is you think about their case, right? What are we going to do for this client in their case? Where I'm at now is when I think about the case, what does that case say to me about the law? Are there ways to make this a test? Can we push the boundaries? Can we use charter arguments? Can we do advocacy? Can we collect data? I tell private bar lawyers, you see, like family law lawyers, they see this in the trenches every day playing out, right? Do we collect data? Do we start raising these voices? Do we give anecdotal experience? And there are lawyers out there who then connect the very individual casework to the advocacy work, right? And it's not always easy to do. I'm not saying that everyone's going to have the time, the financial ability, or the ability to do it. But then that's when you think about who are the people out there who might, right? Who are the people you can connect with at Schlifer, at SALCO, or at Black, or at Aboriginal Legal Services, or at Color Poverty, all of these places that are doing that advocacy work. How can you feed into it, right? Do you have time to volunteer? Do you have time to tell them about cases? I get outreach, and I'm sure Deepa does, from lawyers who say, listen, I saw this in a case. Do you think there's a test case here? Can we work together, right? As lawyers, can we work together, and what can we do? And really thinking about something that I didn't get in law school, which I think they do better now, that idea of not just linearly dealing with your individual case, but seeing how it plugs into the bigger picture. And then also thinking about then what can you do with that, right? And my colleagues get frustrated with me. Every time they come in, I'm saying, well, do you think that law actually should be written that way? Do you think we should add a constitutional question to this case? Do you think, and it's all about capacity, right? But just turning your mind to thinking about that. And the other piece is, you know, I can't say it enough, but if you have the resources to volunteer your time or to even give, even to donate and give to those organizations working with some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people that we're talking about, please consider doing so, right? We've had varying degrees of success in terms of being able to fundraise within the South Asian community. It's, to be frank, been an up and down struggle for us, right? And so we need to do better when we're talking about gender-based violence, when we're talking about South Asian communities, at supporting those communities. And Deepa started with that, right? We need to be the ones who take ownership. We need to be the ones who talk about it, but we need to be the ones who support it as well, right?
Deepa, would you like to chime in on some of Shalini's excellent suggestions and calls to action?
Absolutely. I think what Shalini is saying, you know, sometimes when you hear someone use like all of the above, that's my short answer. Only a couple of things that I would like to add is that if you are really interested in gender-based violence work, I mean, people like me and Shalini who work with these cases, we know that the unpredictable timelines and the complexity of the cases, it definitely make these cases a much more challenging. So if you want to think about what are the few tools that in your box you should really have, think about the trauma and the impacts of violence that has on your client, that personal history of your client, that multidimensional trauma, not only the interpersonal one, but also the systemic challenges. I think that systemic discrimination piece is really important to keep at the really forefront of your client work, because that really changes how you would approach the solutions, as Shalini was saying. So one thing that I can tell you is that the trauma-informed lawyering, I know it's a term that's thrown around a lot and maybe somewhat is a bit more loosey-goosey at times because people don't necessarily sometimes know where to start from. It's a psychological concept, but has an impact on your legal practice. But I would say choose to do some training and then try to see what you can adapt and tailor it for your own need. One kind of trauma-informed training doesn't work for every space, but I can tell you that trauma-informed framework can definitely change the way you approach the practice, not only for your client, but also for yourself. So I do a lot of trainings on vicarious trauma in the legal work, and I can tell you that a lot of us don't necessarily approach vicarious trauma from the trauma-informed lens. And we sometimes think, but we are not surgeons and we are not doctors and we are not health workers. And what vicarious trauma are we talking about? But if you're doing gender-based work and if you're doing gender-based violence work, if you're engaging with the systemic discrimination, I can tell you that it creeps in slowly, steadily, and it actually is there in your work. And the way then it starts impacting is that sometimes you are not connecting with the story. Sometimes you're not hearing to what she's telling you, what is really important to her, because you're focused more on the outcome of the case. And it just starts impacting your overall very well-meaning first steps that you probably took in the area of gender-based violence, and it starts causing harm to yourself. And I don't even talk about harm to the clients, because I know that all of us are extremely ethical, extremely responsible. So it's mostly the harm that you bring to your own self and your own practice that I see a lot in my work. So in my learning and in my teaching, I say start with a trauma-informed framework learning. Start there as your starting point. Then think about, do you have a risk assessment tool? Have you ever read on one? Do you have access to one readily available if you need one? Do you know places where you can refer a client for good, solid safety planning? You don't need to take it on. You're a lawyer. You don't need to be doing safety planning for women. There are lots of experts out there, but you need to have all those experts on your speed dial or on your Zoom call available so that you can actually refer your clients to those services. Absolutely, if you have time and you want to go beyond what your areas of expertise is and work with the gender-based violence as an issue, think about doing pro bono work, absolutely, if you can. Only commit to what you can. That's another important factor. Saying no is really, really compassionate and really, really powerful. It's okay not to take too much. Take what you can really do, and then think about what other vehicles of engagement do you want to engage yourself in. Do you want to be on a committee? Do you want to be at an event? I mean, these days everything is Zoom, but do you want to be part of that? Do you want to do what Richa is doing right now? Do you want to sit on a board that Shalini and I do? So there are many ways of getting engaged with the issue if you're really, really passionate about the issue and want to grow your capacity on around this. So a couple of things that Shalini said, I want to repeat it. Like, if you don't have the resources, but you want to really invest in the issue, write on it, help with the public legal education, and donate. Donations actually really, really make a huge difference. Right now, most of the agencies like ourselves are trying to get food vouchers to clients, cell phones to clients. We're trying to get computers for them. So there is need for resources all the time, not only human resources, but also financial resources. So those are some of your options. And I think you've already made a commitment because you came to this session today. So you're already there. I feel like some of you know this better than I do, but I just wanted to share some of the things that I feel I have learned along my journey.
No, and those are all.
Can I add something? Sorry, just that came to mind when Deepa was speaking. Also, just to acknowledge for all of the people on the call and for all of us that when you work on issues of gender-based violence, and also for us, the intersection of racism and gender-based violence, the trauma also sits with you and you may not realize it, right? And I have this ridiculous personality where I just used to power through and I parked it. I never dealt with those issues. And I will tell you right now, in particular, in light of all of what's going on with deaths in our communities and dealing with it, I feel I did a very poor job understanding the vicarious trauma that has happened for me, right? And I did a very poor job of doing that self-care piece. And I just want everyone to know that if you think it sounds hokey, it's not, right? You cannot discount how much this consciously and subconsciously seeps into my soul, right? My consciousness.
Yeah.
And so you have to also feel comfortable and free to seek support in whatever way you want to. And people like me and Deepa, I think we are, I don't want to speak for Deepa, but I am, but we are happy to support people. We reach out to the people in our connections frequently, but this is hard work. Hearing these things over and over, and what the frustration of it is hard work, and we shouldn't discount for ourselves that we should be warriors, but also there's a toll for doing that, and that we have to make sure that you do what you can do, and that you take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's honestly, Shalini, that's so important. I mean, speaking as someone who deals with a lot of very vulnerable workers in my practice, I'll be honest, like I'm the first person to admit that this is something that I've noticed even in myself, right? And I'm not out there as to be having done it for as long as both of you have, but I know that when I've dealt with things like sexual harassment of a client, right, or a client that was in a particularly precarious, like I can see things coming out even in me, right? And so that thing that both of you are saying about vicarious trauma, I mean, it's so important, because I think as lawyers, you like we're trying so hard for our clients. We're here, we're listening to these webinars, we're getting educated, but we're the last people to take care of ourselves. You can't take care of someone else if you're not taking care of yourself, right? And recognizing this. So that's that's so critically important. So thank you for raising that. I'm going to do two things at once now. So I'm first going to, if this works, hold on. I'm going to share my screen and just provide all of you with some resources that both Deepa and Shalini have very kindly provided us with. So I'll just hold on a second. So these are, obviously education is a big part of what we're trying to do here. And these are resources that the Barbra Schlifer Clinic has passed on from their website. I've sort of copied and pasted in, but visit their website, schliferclinic.com. They've got your self-care strategies. They link to their fundraising campaign, resources for non-status women, crisis resources, food resources, internet security, accessing EI, doctor's consultations, so that holistic approach that both Deepa and Shalini have mentioned, that is so important, that it's not just about taking the legal lens, but also taking a look at the other places in which you can send clients. So that's take a look at these. And then these are also resources that SALCO, that is also on their website, but these are resources that SALCO has provided us with, loads of really, really interesting links, links to the Safe Center of Peel and York Region Center for support for survivors of violence. Their GoFundMe campaign, as Shalini mentioned, and I want to just highlight that in a second, but going through all the different resources that are available for councils of agencies serving South Asians specifically. If you have South Asian clients who want to get more involved in these issues, Punjabi Community Health Services, Social Services Network. So these are all of these are on SALCO's resources page here. Both Shalini and Deepa have shared their respective clinics' fundraising campaigns. And I mean, I'm just gonna, pick up on that and say that as much as it is, as much as we all want to do the big work in getting involved in this issue, this is a small way in which you've seen the amount of work that both of their clinics do. Clinics like theirs, organizations like theirs do so much, and it's as a South Asian community, we can put our resources towards helping them out by giving to these kinds of organizations, because it's something simple. It doesn't take much of our time, but it can make such a big difference to make sure that in a system where there's already such a lack of resources, as we've seen for survivors of gender-based violence, these agencies, these clinics can continue to keep doing the kind of work that they do. So please do keep that in mind. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, but I have a few minutes left for questions, which we do have. So Amin has posed a question. In terms of resources, how have you addressed issues in your practice surrounding women who do not qualify for legal aid, but they are slightly above the income that qualifies for clinics, but they can't make enough to pay private lawyers for family law matters on a long-term basis? I mean, they're also not in the best position to self-represent, so they are out of domestic abuse, but instead falling in financial hardship for retaining lawyers. So I think that's an important question. Maybe Shalini or Deepa, whichever one of you wants to start on that first.
I just wanted to make a point of clarification that Schlifer Clinic is actually not a legal aid tenure clinic. So we are not a legal aid tenured clinic. We are a clinic. We are very much, in hand in hand and, shoulder with shoulder with our legal clinic sisters. But we are a unique institution in that respect that we are not part of the consortium of the legal aid clinic. So our services do not have the same financial criteria. So what is then our criteria? We do have a risk assessment criteria, which actually makes an assessment on which client would be best suited for our services, our specialized services. Our summary legal advice is way more open to people from cross-section of financial capacities and backgrounds. In our representation, we do look at various financial resources available to them, because financial resource availability in the family law context, you can also agree with me, means that they might need a lot more specialized service for property division, so on and so forth, which is not our area of expertise. So what we do is that we try to do, our work is done in 3 different stages. We'll do an assessment, we'll do summary advice, and then for the representation, we actually look at up to $70,000 worth of income, which is way above the legal aid criteria. But yeah, it's a very different kind of a service, unique service, but at the same time, pretty overwhelmed because the numbers are very high. We served 9,000 women last year. I have still not done the final count for the 2019-2020. I can tell you that I'm looking at around 12,000 women. It's going to go even higher, and the resources haven't changed. Without any additional staff, if we keep on doing that work, it's a perfect recipe for a burnout for my colleagues. So we have to balance a lot of factors, but we are not a legal aid clinic, and we are happy to be in that space. That really does give us an autonomy and agency, but it also gives us a sense of precarity because we don't have the same tenure as our sister agencies have.
Shalini, I think you can speak to this from the perspective of an ED at a legal aid funded. How do you?
It's a bad answer, right? Because legal aid is ridiculous in terms of financial criteria. And Deepa's right. Like right now, there's supposed to be much more expanded coverage for, they call it the domestic violence certificate, right? And we hear frequently from clients saying they were turned down. I spoke to a client this morning who got the refugee law certificate and then was told she didn't qualify for the family law certificate. It doesn't make any sense, right? So, and that just leaves that big gaping hole of, and to be frank, I think it's women in particular who end up without resources to navigate the family law system. It's completely broken, right? I mean, what we do try to lean on is obviously the Barbra Schlifer Clinic, but they have capacity issues, right? And we look at all of the court support worker programs that are funded around the province, depending on where the client is, around whether that can give some support to clients who need it. I think those programs are great. I think Schlifer has court support workers, as do many other agencies, including some that work in South Asian communities specifically. So there are these piecemeal resources, but they don't address the long-term need, right? And so we see more and more clients. Our clinic does give family law advice to people, and now has been approached and is in discussion with legal aid around what do we do around that family law piece. So I think it's a bad answer on how do you support those clients now on the direct cases that are happening. It's a good answer on if you can collect those stories and get involved in the advocacy at the province around how they set criteria for legal aid and the disproportionate impact of those decisions, particularly on the gender disproportionalities, the race disproportionalities. There needs to be a resolution there. We were going in the right direction with increasing those eligibility criteria, but all of that's been repealed, right? We're also looking at a legal aid system that had drastic cuts and may continue to have drastic cuts. So you're sort of in this catch-22 around seeing more and more self-represented litigants and not seeing any political will to do anything about it, right?
Yeah, which is tough. I mean, I know I get this issue in my practice all the time, right? At clinic, there's sometimes you can't take on everyone, and particularly when we're dealing with those limits, which is unfortunate. But overall, I mean, there is a lot of systematic advocacy to be done. I hope people who have joined today have been as educated as I've been just listening to both of you on the massive amount of intersecting issues that do affect gender-based violence. Even though it's one concept, it's a big, all-encompassing concept that has a lot of different moving pieces to it, and a lot of things that we as lawyers, as advocates, as community agencies can do something about. So take away however many takeaways you can from all the amazing things that Shalini and Deepa had to say today. We don't seem to have any more questions apart from Nevradeep, who's asking, does this session carry some CPD? So you can claim substantive hours for this. That should be fine. Beyond that, I just wanted to thank, now that we're at 3:30, Deepa and Shalini for just, not just giving us their time today and taking time out of their busy days to speak to us about this, but just for all the amazing work that you do and the differences that both of you are making through your work and through your practices, and for joining us and for remaining engaged with SABA. We really, really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed listening to both of you speak today, and I hope all of you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you also to Divya Khurana, who put in a lot of time and effort in organizing and spearheading this panel. She's the co-chair of our Women's Committee, and also to Sarah Malik and the board for their support in putting all of this together. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to do what we do without them. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend. I hope you will take these conversations back and have them with your offices, with your colleagues. Think about how you're going to adopt some of them into your practices and get involved with this issue. And wishing all of you all the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.